The point is, it is possible and it must be so that you look at this particular concept of dharmic civilizationalism independent of the lens of European nationalism. Unfortunately, the moment this discussion starts, I think people start cherry picking certain facts, which is that the constitution is fundamentally antithetical to, or is it loggerheads with, the Hindutva vision of a Hindu Rashtra, so to speak. So perhaps you may want to look at the draft constitution that was presented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which actually promised equal rights to religious minorities. And the reason why this is important for us to point out is because, assuming for a moment that we did not have the concept of contemporary constitutionalism emanating from Europe, even then, Bharat as a civilization has always welcomed those people who are willing to live with us. We did not have a constitution when persecuted Parsis knocked at the doors of Bharat. We did not have a constitution when, let's say, the Jews from your state, so to speak, and even from the Northeast, knocked at the doors of Bharat. So to attribute certain large-heartedness entirely to the constitution, I would say, is to protect the constitution at the expense of the civilization, which I think is grave injustice.
I've never done that.
I'll just finish my point.
When you finish.
So as far as I am concerned, to assume that the constitution is somehow a civilizing tool which seeks to educate and civilize and, let's say, uplift a certain regressive society, which is at loggerheads with the value of constitutionalism, which doesn't know what is democracy, which doesn't know what it is to accommodate minorities. No. It is a product of the fundamental spirit of this particular land. And despite the horrors of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality and tragedy of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality of the two-nation theory, which was specifically foisted on us, which we must never forget, I think this country has done a vastly superior job of protecting its minorities than our former, let's say, estranged cousins, so to speak. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact. So it actually is very, very surprising when we are constantly told that this particular country, if it becomes a Hindu Rashtra, or if it becomes a dharmic civilizational state, so to speak, is bound to become what you refer to in your book as the Hindu Pakistan. I'm sorry, I think that's grave injustice to the people of this country, because accommodation is something, an accommodation, not Western style assimilation. Accommodation has been the spirit of this country, because Western style assimilation requires you to convert to their way of life in one form or the other, either overtly or covertly, in order for you to be accepted as part of that particular society. It is this country that makes it possible for people to keep their culture alive in the most perhaps pristine form possible, so long as it does not come in the way of others. So I would actually make the case that dharmic civilizationalism is what is crudely dubbed as Hindu nationalism. And as a student of constitutional law, not to claim specific expertise or drop names here, I believe that whenever public morality has been referred to in the Constituent Assembly debates, the reference has been to the reservoir of this country's public morality drawn from the vast ocean of dharma. And as far as I understand, the concept of dharma is native to this particular land, so to speak, and its culture. And there is one clarification or correction that I think is very, very important, that it's possible to simply reduce the so-called Indic reawakening, so to speak, as identity politics. It's possible to muddle it to the level of identity politics. In my humble opinion, that would be perhaps the most superficial way of looking at it, because scholarship, psychology, political science, as well as students of history strike a very clear distinction between identity and consciousness, which is to say you can be a Hindu in name and still think like a foreigner, because your language and your accent and everything could be something that is completely alien to this land. So according to me, identity is less important and consciousness is more important, which is why if I had to choose between an Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, I would choose a Dara Shikoh simply because in consciousness, he was closer to the Hindu spirit, notwithstanding his identity. But Aurangzeb, for all practical purposes, his consciousness and identity were one and the same and completely antithetical to the nature of this land and its accommodative spirit. So that is the distinction. And the third point that I think needs to be made very, very clearly, because Savarkar's work, whether it is capable of being misinterpreted, misconstrued, or interpreted in the right manner, is not the touchstone of Indic Renaissance, because it is the typical strawman. One of the strawmans that's created is to basically say Hindutva is ethnocentric. It has a certain obsession with race, and therefore, in its rejection of religious minorities, it is merely presenting another form of xenophobia. The fact of the matter is, this land has accommodated several races, and not all of these races are necessarily native to what we understand as Bharat. They have come from several parts of the world, but have ultimately become part of this particular land simply because their way of life has managed to find a way of coexisting with us without actually having a fundamental principle which sees us as subhuman or dehuman. So anyone who is willing to let go of any particular tenet that has the effect of rendering me a second-class citizen or a second-class human being, forget citizen, is welcome in this particular country so long as he doesn't threaten to sever my roots to this particular land. So the idea which I'm trying to present is that dharmic civilizational reawakening is not a restatement or a sophisticated way of presenting xenophobia or ethnocentrism, because ethnocentrism and xenophobia are the legacies of European style nationalism, not Bharatiyata, so to speak. We have to be understood in terms of our ontology, epistemology and theology in that particular order, not in terms of anthropology. Anthropology is the obsession of the European Westerner, not of Bharatiyas.